But I do want you to understand a few concepts with respect to how your genes work. So, when you create your gametes, it's not a simple one-for-one exchange with respect to making those gametes. Now, what the heck does she mean by that? Well, it would help if I actually put the screen on so you could see it. When you create your gametes, we've already established that you're not giving the whole map to each gamete. What you're giving is one copy of each of the two copies of alleles that you possess for every single protein that you make. Everybody get what I just said? Correct. So your 46 chromosome complement of information is actually duplicate information. For each protein that you make, for the most part, there are some exceptions to the rule, and we'll talk about them at the end of the chapter, you have two copies or two alleles for every single protein that you make in your body. No, some of them are dominant, some of them are recessive. Oops. And those are terms that describe the genes that make the proteins, or actually describe the end product, the proteins themselves, and how they exhibit themselves in the body. So we talked a little bit about brown eyes and blue eyes last class, and we said that brown eyes was a dominant trait to blue eyes. In other words, when the brown eye gene expresses itself, if a recessive gene is also producing a protein along with it, because remember, we have two copies for eye color. Again, this is not exactly how it works. This is a very watered down explanation of how it works. So I have two copies of a gene. I'm making two different proteins for eye color if I'm heterozygous for that trait. I'm making two copies of a protein that are the same if I am homozygous for the trait. So if a trait, a protein that is produced, is dominant to another protein that might also be produced, which is recessive, what are you physically going to see? The dominant one. So brown eyes, blue eyes, what are you physically going to see? What's that called, by the way? Your phenotype, what the characteristic actually looks like, due to the expression of that protein. You're making both proteins. You're making proteins for brown eyes, you're making proteins for blue eyes. But what do you see? Brown, because brown, in this case, for this particular protein, this particular trait, is going to kind of mask the other one. Those are traits that follow the dominant and recessive rule. So I'm going to talk about some that don't follow that rule. They're not quite as cut and dry as a dominant recessive in a minute. But I don't want to lose this concept. When I make my gametes, I have two chromosomes, and I'm just going to make these squares, that have similar alleles. They pair up together based on the information they possess. So I don't know which pair of chromosomes that is. Maybe it's the 16th pair of chromosomes. We'll find that the alleles on this pair are the same. One has eye color, the other one eye color. And that code will make a protein for eye color. These chromosomes that pair up together are called what? The same homologous chromosomes. When you make your gametes, are you going to give the whole pair to your gametes? No, what are you going to give? You can only give one copy of all these different things to your gametes. So we're going to take this one and give it to my sperm if I'm a male, and this one and give it to another sperm. Yes? It doesn't happen that way, though. You can only give one copy, but what happens during the second split is the little ends of these pairs of chromosomes can actually cross over and switch, so that, say I have this one here and this one here. During meiosis II, there's an event called crossing over. So what might happen is a piece from this one might switch and go to that one, and a piece from this one might switch and go to that one. You can see the representative colors in the diagram. And again, this is a process called crossing over. And we see the diagram on page 1098 in the textbook. So it doesn't happen split for split. We kind of mix up our genetic information.
But if they're the same, what mix? You said that they both the same.
No, they carry the same what? Alleles for the same protein for the same trait. They don't necessarily have to be the same protein, right?
Right.
What if you have brown eyes, blue eyes?
Right. If you're heterozygous, then they
One
would
side's
be
brown,
different.
one side's blue.
But no matter what, that little guy is going to get an allele for eye color. And no matter what, whatever that trait was, that little guy is going to get one of them. Yes? But it's not a complete even split all the time. We actually mix up our genetic pool. So say, and the reason I want to bring this up is, say you get a chromosome from mother and you get a chromosome from father. You get certain traits on one and the other. It's not always going to stay that way in your genome. So when you pass your information to the gametes, one doesn't get all mother genes and one doesn't get all father genes. Do you see where I'm going with this? Because of the fact that that information crosses over, one chromosome that you give a gamete is a combination of information that you got from both parents because of the fact that crossover takes place. You're still going to get one copy of everything, but it's going to be a combination of stuff your grandmother and grandfather gave to your mother or father.
That's crazy. Because you're thinking, oh, my child is a combination of my mom and dad and Addie's mom and dad, but then it's also a combination of their mom and dad, my mom and dad.
Correct. So because of crossing over, that mixes up our gene pool even more. It's extremely important to mix up our gene pool, because if we stay close with respect to giving genetics to our offspring, we enhance the chance of giving defective genetics to our offspring. Okay? Question?
So when both gametes will meet, like sperm and ova, they both have only half of information, 23 chromosomes from ovum and from sperm, right?
Correct.
But all the information they have in this 23 chromosomes regarding all our body, all proteins, so how they pick which one will dictate our eye color or our...
It depends on how the protein is.
Dominant?
If it's dominant recessive, that's not necessarily the case. So, before I go on, do you understand this? So the genes you get are not just one from one parent or one grandparent. They're a combination of many people. And doing this is going to ensure the chances that if there are mutations in your genetic material, you can kind of weed them out in your offspring. The closer you stay passing mutations in your genes to your offspring, the bigger chance that they're going to have that same mutation as well. Okay, so we have traits that are dominant and we have traits that are recessive, right? The blue eyes and the brown eyes example.
I have a
No problem.
You said that, like, eye color, let's say, is 16 chromosomes.
Yeah.
Is, like, every person chromosome number, like, is the 16th chromosome? I mean, I don't know what
Yes.
they are, but, like, for me, it's eye color for everybody.
Correct.
16th is eye color.
Yep.
Or just,
Our genomes within
color.
species are the same.
okay.
Yes.
So whatever.
That's what makes us who we are.
Whatever chromosome 1 is, like.
It's the same.
color as-
There probably is exceptions out there, but not huge exceptions. Because if there were huge exceptions, we would see that you as a species would be different, and you might not be able to survive. So when I look at a species as a group, and I look at their map, I'm going to see the types of alleles are going to be found on the same chromosome numbers. The alleles, the information themselves, can be very different. Okay, so crossing over, understand the concept. Understand that crossing over is going to allow for more diversity within the species. The more diverse you are, typically the more healthy you are. That's not always the case, but it does help with the health of a species. Now, they talk about types of inheritance next, dominant, recessive. These are not the only thing, not the only way genes are expressed. But again, with eye color, there's one example, the expression of the proteins, if you have a dominant recessive scenario, the dominant trait tends to mask the recessive trait phenotypically. So yeah, we did this last class, right? So we looked at a heterozygous female and a heterozygous male. Oh, thank you, hon. And pick a trait, any trait. Well, you can stick to eye color if you want.
How about blood type?
That's different.
Oh, this-
Yes, we're not there yet, Mila. I will give you a big sign when we get there. Okay, so dominant and recessive trait, and we used eye color and we used big B and little b. Typically when you work out some of the statistics with respect to traits, if it's dominant and recessive, the capital letter tends to be what kind of trait? The dominant of the trait. The small letter tends to be the recessive of the trait. So what we see here is kind of a copy of a dominant recessive mating between two heterozygous individuals. Now, if the trait is dominant, both of these individuals phenotypically are going to look the same. So say it's that brown-eyed thing. Because each of them only needs to possess one allele for a dominant trait in order to physically show that dominant trait. So if I have brown eyes, and we worked through the example last class, right? If I have brown eyes, I know half my genotype. For sure is what? I have one dominant gene, but I don't know what the recessive one is. Or excuse me, I don't know what the second one is, because I can't physically see that. The only way to figure it out is to have offspring or to do a genetic mapping. So when two heterozygous individuals mate, we're going to see offspring that possess a recessive trait. The other way to figure out if an individual has a recessive gene is to do what? And what did I do in my marriage? Yeah, marry someone who is what? Or mate with someone. That's right, you don't know. Homozygous recessive. So when we talk about dominant and recessive traits, we can do test crosses. And this is what the man, believe it or not, back in the 1800s, by the name of Mendel, discovered a lot about genetics and some of the genetic laws that we follow still to this day were discovered by him. And he crossed, do you know what he did? Peas. And looked at characteristic in the plants that were produced from these crossings. Plants are sexually reproducing organisms, bless you. So they need sperm and oocyte to create a brand new plant. So we live, did you know that? Yeah, you live in Maine. What happens during the the springtime. And I learned this the hard way when I moved to Maine.
Allergies, pollen.
What is pollen?
It's
I'm going to gross you out a little bit.
reproductive,
It's sperm!
right,
Yes!
plant sperm.
Plant sperm. Where's the oocyte in a pine tree? It's in the cone. So when we look at the reproductive system of a pine tree, at the top of the pine tree you see these tiny little cones, and you'll see them drop after they release all of their pollen, these tiny, tiny little cones. Those are the male portion of the plant. They'll release their sperm, and why do you think the cones are lower in the tree?
So that they can't do it.
Yeah, hopefully it'll fall down and hopefully fertilize a lot of these cones. But what's something that helps to that fertilization process in other plants? Bees. Because when they go to a plant, and a plant will attract them by giving off things that are yummy for them, nectar, they'll go to the plant, they'll eat the nectar and brush against the little structures that hold the pollen for the plant. In the center, we see the female portion in the flower, and at the top, that's the entrance for fertilization for the ovum in a plant. So stamen, pestils, you've heard those little things. You can go Google that up.
Can the
But
same plant fertilize itself?
yes,
Because it releases pollen and
correct.
has-
But why do we have so much diversity in our plant world?
also move.
Correct. So it can get carried by air, it can get carried by animals, it can get carried by insects. And that's why we see such a diverse number of flowers and plants on our planet. Because through the years we keep creating these hybrids by cross-pollinating due to all of these
Just
good
like
guys.
When you go to buy seeds for like to plant a garden, you can pick from like 60 different types of cucumbers.
Correct. Yep. Or basil or anything. Because we've created this, diversity's been created because of different plants pollinating. And diversity is good, right? More hardy offspring, for the most part.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, how do you know, because like you were saying about your example up there, that you know you have this brown eyes, you have brown eyes. How do you know your husband is homozygous blue? Like, how do you know that his second
Because the only way I would see blue eyes, and it's only for this trait because it's dominant and recessive. The only way I would see blue eyes in my husband is if he made 2 blue-eyed proteins. If he makes anything else, what's it going to do? It would be masking that blue-eyed gene. Do you see what I mean?
And if she made a blue-eyed child, then she knows that she has to have the...
Correct. I made the blue-eyed child, kid number 2, right? So I know that I had to, in order for me to see blue eyes in that child has to have what as a genotype?
BB.
Yeah.
Little B, little B.
And she got 1 from her father, and guess who got from me? So that's how I know I'm heterozygous brown-eyed. It's all variations of the color. I'm just using brown and blue. But again, as we go through time and species genetics mutate, we get all these different hair colors, eye colors, skin colors, because of different combinations among different individuals.
With other traits like hair color, like you might know your first allele because of what your phenotype is,
But you don't know what the
you
other,
don't know what the second one is
until you,
reproduce.
correct.
But then that still might not be
Correct.
completely.
Because the example I gave you, my mother must be heterozygous brown-eyed, right?
Right.
If you look back on her tree, we see her father had blue eyes. But if you look back on my father's tree, there's brown eyes forever and ever. Now, we still can't even assume that I got it from my mother, because my father might be carrying that from generations to generations that we never see outwardly because of the matings that were made by the individuals. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, this table on page 1100, give us an example of a whole bunch of different traits. Anybody in this room, can you roll your tongue?
No.
Oh, you can do it. Who else can? Okay.
We can't?
Uh-uh. Cannot do it. Now, my sister can do it. I can't do it.
My husband can actually.
I can make it like fold. But
You can fold it, you can't roll it? That's actually a dominant trait. They call it Z. So when we talk genetics, they're going to give letters to all these different alleles when they discuss them. So dominant traits, tongue rollers, freckles, dimples, widow's peak, double jointed thumb, guess what else is a dominant trait?
Now, can you have some and not all?
Yeah.
Like I have astigmatism.
Yep.
I have freckles.
What is this?
Do you know what that is?
Oh, where's
It's called achondroplasia, dwarfism. That's a dominant trait. Just because it's dominant, does that mean you're going to see it dominating in a population? No. Come to find out that particular trait, in order to possess achondroplasia, which is a dominant trait, and survive, you have to be heterozygous for the trait. If you're heterozygous, if you're homozygous for the trait, you won't develop as an embryo, you'll die in vitro. Okay? So all the people you see with dwarfism are heterozygous for that trait.
Which is why you see them in normal.
Yeah. So there's a show on TV, and I don't think they didn't put it. Yeah, a Little People show. So two dwarf, and again, because these are two heterozygous individuals for the trait, mated, and they have 3 normal children and 1 child who is dwarf. Is that statistically right? No, but you know what? Each chance, it's a flip of the coin. So they could statistically have all normal children, even if they had 20. Because the chance of passing normal versus abnormal to your offspring is what? 50-50, just like a coin toss.
Normal kids could end up
So
having
what?
kids.
No, because why? If they only had 1,
They got 2, yeah.
then they got 2 normal genes.
Right, because if they had gotten one of these,
They would be?
they would be dwarf because it's dominant.
Correct.
So they're homozygous,
Yes.
normal size.
Correct.
I don't know who the correct.
Right, they carry the recessive, which is normal size gene.
So what's the difference between dominant genes, inheritance with regarding of different diseases? Dominant?
Same thing. It depends on the disease. It depends on the genetics. So different diseases, if they're dominant,
So it says dominant disorder are not uncommon. They are uncommon. It's not common because they many are liver result of death.
yep,
So why is that?
it's just because of the way that humans work. Why is it that embryos don't develop who are homozygous for dwarfism? It's because of the way humans are made. So for some metabolic reason, if you carry 2 of this particular trait, you can't survive. And that's just human metabolism. I can't answer that question why.
It has to be heterozygous.
Not always, but in certain diseases. In this particular trait, that's the case. Not all, but that one. And there's a list of them. Do you have to memorize them all? No. Okay. Yes? Did I answer your question? So it's not necessarily a cut and dry thing.
That's why I don't understand. That's why I don't think I would be able.
Okay, let's see if we can cover it after I go over the rest of the material.
You don't necessarily need to know these, but just
No.
understand that there are dominant and recessive
Correct.
genes and
Yep,
how they react. to that.
correct.
Okay.
And there's certain diseases that are recessive. So in order to, if you have a recessive disease, what do you have to possess in order to have the disease?
Allele.
Right. So for cystic fibrosis, in order to have cystic fibrosis, if it's a recessive trait, what do you have to have? 2 of your alleles have to be possessed for cystic fibrosis.
Which is, it says is actually, okay.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay? And again, there's tons of different traits, there's tons of different diseases. They all follow different rules. So I'm not going to make you memorize
Like
that.
a parent that has, like, that doesn't have, like, 2 parents that don't have cystic fibrosis.
Could have a child
Could
with.
have a child with, because they
Correct.
gave that gene.
You got it.
But the chances of like one person having it and one person not, is it more significant?
It depends. It depends on your genetic history.
What
Do you know what I mean?
if the person doesn't have any history of it?
It had to come from somewhere. Yeah. So again, you can mask genes from many, many generations. So say somebody with cystic fibrosis gene, yeah, exactly, 5 generations ago. And in your family, you keep passing that cystic fibrosis gene on, but because it's a recessive trait and you only give your offspring one, you don't see it in your offspring. Until all of a sudden you meet Joe Schmo from the neighborhood around the corner who also has been doing this for years and years and years and never knew there was cystic fibrosis until you two mate and what? Yeah, you give that offspring both your recessive genes. No, it's recessive. And you have to, in order to possess a a recessive disorder, you have to be what? Homozygous for the disorder. Make sense?
Yeah, so both parents has it.
Yes. They might not necessarily, you might not necessarily, like the blue-eyed thing. We could be carrying blue-eyed genes for generations and generations. Even in my father's family, even though there's brown eyes all over the place, they could be passing that blue-eyed gene from generation to generation. We never know.
Right. So
Until we create a recessive homozygous individual.
Cystic fibrosis reproduced, that mother would automatically give a cystic fibrosis
Correct.
allele.
Yes.
So already 50% chance that that child is going to have cystic fibrosis.
No. Not unless her mate has, yes.
The gene.
Yeah, so here's the cross. Let's say, let's use letters. Let's use F because they're easy to see, small and little. So here's here's the mother with cystic fibrosis, right? Because it's a recessive trait, she's got 2 genes. Now here's a normal father, correct? If the father is that kind of normal, then all the offspring are going to be this. They won't have it. But if the father is this kind of normal, then there's a what? There's a 1/4, 25% chance that one of those offspring is going to be.
So how do you know if that person is normal? Like,
They don't have cystic fibrosis.
Well, right. So if everything's fine with them.
Correct.
So you would have to have genetic mapping done.
You mean, how do you know that they're a heterozygous for the trait?
You don't, unless
You'd have to do a DNA map. You'd have to do a DNA map. Yep. Yes.
Even have a trait. So you said they both have to be homozygous and recessive on the disorder?
Depends on the disorder.
on these ones.
Right. So if it's a dominant trait, just like brown eyes, so use the brown-eyed, blue-eyed thing to keep yourself straight. If it's a trait that follows a dominant recessive rule, all you need is one, and you will possess the trait. If it's a recessive trait, you have to have what? Both to possess the trait. They call you, if you carry one of those recessive genes and you don't have the trait, they call you a carrier. Okay, and again, different genetics will reflect in different ways.
You might not have it, but
You can give it to your offspring, or you might, depending on the disease, like sickle cell anemia, for example. You might possess not a full-blown sickle cell anemia, but you might tend to be a little anemic because you won't have the full-blown disease like somebody who is homozygous. Okay?
Speaking of genetics, did you read the article that was in, I think it was National Geographic, about how they think that redheads will be extinct in 100 years? I did.
You think?
So
Really?
That's that case, my family is going strong. We're being overtaken by redheads.
Build that population.
All right. So not all genes and not all gene expression is cut and dry, dominant, and recessive. Remember, when I possess an allele, I make a what? I make a protein. Some alleles will make proteins that have independent expression. So the 2 copies that you get of that particular allele will be seen in your offspring. This is what we call multiple allele inheritance. Now, multiple allele refers to the fact that there are more than 2 alleles for any given trait. Remember when we talked about blood type? And here we are, Mila. We're on blood type. We talked about blood type, right? There were a whole bunch of different ones. And then we talked about naturally occurring antibodies and all of that discussion we had way back when. Well, now let's talk a little bit about the genetics of blood type. The gene in which you possess your protein information on is called I. And in humans, there's not just 2 different I's that you could have. There's actually 3 different I's that you could have. So for blood type and the proteins associated with blood type, you can have an allele called IA, or you can have an allele called IB, or you can have an allele called little I. Now it's not the recessive and it's not dominant. It doesn't follow that rule. No. So we're talking about different rules. Let me finish, and then hopefully I'll answer your question. With blood type, remember we talked about naturally occurring antibodies. A, B, O. You have 2 copies of this information that you get from your parents. Even though there's 3 different possibilities, you can only have what? You only get 2. So on your genetic material, genetic information, you get 2 copies of alleles, one from your mother, one from your father. And both of those alleles will produce proteins that will be expressed and seen in the offspring. So it's not dominant and recessive. One doesn't mask the other. They kind of all work together to give us our outcome. So when we look at an individual's genetics, this chart here shows us some of the different possibilities we can have. So if I get from my mother, my type A mother, let's do this one because then we can see all the combos, and my type B father, who is heterozygous for these traits, which means I have my 2 copies. Are they the same? No, they're different. If I cross these 2 guys and create a Punnett square, mother can only give 1 to her gametes.
So mother has type A blood.
Mother has type A blood because you are going to express proteins on the surface of your cells, for the genes that you have. Little I gives us very different proteins in which you don't have A and you don't have B on the surface of your cells. So you have neither A nor B. You still have proteins on the surface of your cells, but they're not A and they're not B. We call that what? Type O. So, okay, mother can give me that or that, yes? And father can give me this or this.
So little I is representing nothing?
No, little I is representing no A, no B. Yes? But when I possess this guy here, when I possess two separate alleles, I'm going to express two separate proteins. They don't mask each other. Does that make sense? So this person is type what?
AB.
This person is type AB. This person is B, because what's on the surface of that person's cells? B proteins and not nothing, not A or B. Yes? Same thing with that guy. And this guy is, because what's on the surface of that guy's cells? No A, no B. There's still proteins. Making sense? Okay, so what's different from this type A person and this type A person?
That person has both types of proteins are A.
So they make a little more A's than these guys. But they're still what?
A.
A's. Yes? Okay? So in this case, multiple allele inheritance, we see that those proteins are being produced. We are seeing them expressed from both alleles. It's not dominant and recessive. It's kind of a combination of the two with respect to expression in the new individual, the offspring. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. The thing is, in PowerPoint it says, and you can read.
Okay, Mila, say it, say it, say it.
Mistake. It says that I, A, and IB are co-dominant, and I is recessive. This is what the book says, and this is what.
Little I is recessive?
Yeah, it says in the book. It says in the.
Well, it's not A or not B. It's not recessive.
So that's why it's confusing.
Yeah.
Because now how you explain that
Makes sense.
But that in the book in here.
Good.
that
So when I explained it, does it make more sense? Good. So cross that off.
It's not recessive.
Correct.
I guess that, I mean, I get what you said, but I always thought that based on the mom's blood type and the dad's blood type, that the child would get one of them, but I didn't ever think it was a mixture.
It's a mixture.
It always is?
Yep. The other one, when we talk about blood type, is RH. So you either have it or you don't.
That's the negative and negative.
And that's the positive and negative part. And then we talk about the whole antibody thing, and that's a little bit different. Again, we don't understand why this happens, why we make antibodies against an antigen we don't have, because that is the only exception. You know, there are some weird things that go on, but that's the exception to the rule.
So
Usually,
what is O positive? And my ex-husband's is AB.
so you're this, and that's probably why they call it recessive, because you have to be homozygous little I to be type O. But that's not recessive. So that's the wrong terminology to use. Does that make sense? So go ahead, you're O.
Is AB positive? Basically, is AB positive.
Okay, now we're talking about not just one trait. So we're talking about several genes being passed on. Okay, and that, I don't want to get there because it doesn't really talk about it in your book. But RH, you're positive, yes? So you could be that and still make that on the surface of your cells, yes? He's what?
AB positive.
And so he could be this too. He could be this, or he could be this. Same with you. So it is possible that your offspring may, depending on what your genotype is, be Rh negative if you both are heterozygous for that particular protein.
If they homozygous, they can't produce.
If they're Rh negative, then they have no capital R's. So that's a different scenario.
So in terms of their blood types, because I don't even know what they are. That's what I was wondering about.
Your kids could be, so let's figure out what your kids could be. So I'm not going to do the RH because
They can't be
it's a
O.
pain. No.
Because the dad's A.
Correct.
They can be A or B.
Correct.
Or AB.
Correct. No.
No.
They could be
A
A or B. Yeah.
Yeah.
So IA. I only put one there because I'd just be repeating information here. This is what your kids. They're going to either be type A or B, and then the RH, so that's a crapshoot.
So they have to be A or B, they can't be AB, and they can't be O.
Nope.
That's crazy. This is awesome.
They can be O. They
Nope.
cannot be O.
No, how?
Yeah, and
Because this guy doesn't have a little I.
I.
The only way to be O is, yes? Okay, now, it's not even done. Genetics is an extremely complex subject. And again, we're just doing baby stuff in here. All right? So now, each trait may not necessarily be controlled by just one allele. All right? To confuse it even more, sometimes you don't have two alleles for a trait. Because some of the alleles for specific traits are carried on the sex chromosomes. Now, that's an X chromosome. A lot more information, yes? That's a Y chromosome. Not so much information. Some of the information that's carried on the X chromosome is missing on the Y chromosome. I say it's the information that enables men to put their socks in the hamper. It enables them to put the toilet seat down, put on the roll. Yes, all that information is missing. I'm kidding. So I think, Mio, I'm going to make an amazing discovery and find this out. So some traits, and we call them sex-linked traits.
So this is
Yeah, I know, poor guy.
only, for the
Right, both these
characteristics, for sex characteristics.
for sex characteristics. So on the X chromosome, sex characteristics as well. But then we also have those traits. Some examples of traits where we find it on the X chromosome is things like proteins that give us color blindness, baldness. Those are only on the X chromosome, okay? They're not on the Y chromosome. That's why we tend to see these things in males at a higher percentage, because they only have one shot. If they get an abnormal gene on their X chromosome, they get no backup. Females, on the other hand, have what? Two X chromosomes. So they have a better chance of not having those traits because, just like that blood type, you get two copies. You have a backup. So if one of them has a... No, you have more of a chance to inherit a normal one. If you only have one... Yeah, because what we'll see in the female cells, one of the X chromosomes becomes inactivated, okay? But it's random. So it's not always the same X chromosome. It's different ones in different cells. So you still have a chance of making normal proteins because you have two copies. And if you possess a normal one, then you're going to be normal with respect to color blindness and eye color. Yeah, go back and listen to the, yeah. All right, so that's called a sex-linked trait. And there's certain, again, baldness, colorblind, those are good examples. That's why we tend to see them higher in males, percentage-wise, because they only get one copy. Yes? So if you're bald and you're a male, don't blame your father. It's not his fault. Whose fault is it? It's your mother's fault, because she's the one that gave you that gene. Yes? So if you want to figure out if you're going to be bald, don't be looking at your father's father. Go look at your, or your, yeah, on your father's side. All right, even more confusion. So we have sex-linked inheritance. Now we have something called polygenic inheritance. And this is where it's not just one allele that's going to code for proteins that give us a characteristic. It's more than one. Polygenic. when we talk about skin color in humans, we see that there's 3 different alleles that code for your skin color. So the combination of that group of proteins is what give us our skin color. Now we're really talking confusion with respect to Punnett squares, because now we're talking about passing on 3 different alleles. Let's call them A. And remember, you have what? 2 copies of each. So this person is recessive, very, very light person, crossed with very, very dark person. What you're going to get, and this is the scary part, that first set of offspring is going to look like this. Yes? They're going to be right down the middle. Now, what happens when they cross? Remember, you can only give 1 copy. Now we're going to figure out what the alleles look like, and then you'll understand why this is confusing as hell. You can only give 1 copy of each allele to your sperm, egg, offspring. Yes? But some alleles assort independently. They're not necessarily linked. Yeah. So what could be the combination? What could be the possible outcome? They sort independently. And I'm going to show you what the sort. So what are the possible gametes that this person can produce with respect to skin color? Watch. Big A, big B, big C. Or big A, little b, big C. Or big A, little b, little c. You getting it? Yeah, any combination. So now what we see is a huge diversity in this particular trait because of the fact that it's polygenic inheritance. So when you look at some of the different numbers in a polygenic inheritance, when 3 alleles are responsible for the trait, the numbers are staggering. So you have no idea what those children are going to look like.
So is that like there's 64 possibilities? It says like
These are all the different possibilities. So we'd work that whole Punnett square out, and I don't even have enough board space to do it. But when we work it all out, I would have 15 chances of this combo, and I have 20 chances of this combo. The total number would be 64. In a regular Punnett square, what's the total number? 4.
And that's interesting that that's for height.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different traits that aren't just cut and dry. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. Some traits, and this is an example from the plant world again. Mr. Mendel did experiments on different plants and looked at color in the flowers. Let's call this one, there's 2 different alleles, red and white. Okay? If I possess 2 reds, I'm going to be what? And if I possess 2 whites, I'm going to be, guess what happens if I'm this? Yeah, I'm pink. This is called incomplete dominance. Ever make Christmas cookies? Okay, do you ever try and make a red Christmas cookie? Pain in the keister, isn't it? Why? Yeah, you have to put lots and lots of red food coloring in. Yeah, same with Play-Doh, right? So think of these proteins, the more of them that I have, the more that I'll see. With respect to red, if I'm a red plant and I make a double dose of red proteins, I'm going to see a red flower. But if I'm heterozygous for the trait, it's like me trying to make those red cookies with a half a tube of food coloring. I only have 1 shot. not 2 shots, of that red protein in my system. So I'm not going to see red because I don't have enough proteins to see red. I only have enough proteins to see an intermediate of that red. And that's where we get that intermediate pink color. Okay?
But that's only incomplete, right?
Exactly. So we're going to see a whole bunch of different combinations with respect to genetics. Genetics is definitely not cut and dry. Not only that, but not only your genetics are going to determine what you look like and the genes that you express, but your environment is going to determine that as well. So you might possess certain genes, but not express them because of your environment. So even more complex information with respect to genetics. Did you have a question, hon? You're just stretching?
Going back to the skin color thing, would you, my cousin married a man that's dad is really dark and his mom is white.
Mm-hmm.
So they got married and he is like a mixed color. And then my cousin and her husband had a daughter who was like a mixed color. They had a son who is white skin, pale blonde hair, wicked blue eyes. Like they don't even look related. It's insane.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's certain, like my father's from Italy, my mother's first generation Italian. We tend to be darker skinned, but there's certain areas, certain generations where we see very light skinned Italians, like Sicilians, for example, tend to be much lighter in skin and red head. So you see this light red-headed kid and you say, what's your nationality? He says Italian. You're like, I don't think so. But because of variations within the species in different areas, we can see a huge diverse variation. Okay, so environmental factors are also going to play a role in gene expression. So even though you carry genes, you might not necessarily express them based on your metabolism, your chemistry, and your environment. So they talk a little bit about beyond DNA, regulation of gene expression, and some of the research that's been done with respect to gene expression. I'm not going to get crazy about you knowing specifics of small RNAs or epigenetic markers. Don't worry about that. What I do want you to know as far as extranuclear mitochondrial inheritance is when mom makes that big fat oocyte, it's got all the cellular parts for that brand new individual, including mitochondria. Because remember, that little sperm's traveling light. What's in the sperm? Chromosomes, right? But what's in the oocyte? Chromosomes and all the other parts. Mitochondria has its own DNA. Your cells, because of the fact that your mitochondria has its own DNA, can make more mitochondria when it needs it. So when you are undergoing exercise, for example, your skeletal muscle cells can make more mitochondria if they need to make more energy, because of the fact that mitochondria has its own DNA. That DNA comes from who? Mama, because there's no mitochondria that gets passed on here. Mitochondria is in the neck, that gets broken off. Yes? So your genetic information, your mitochondrial DNA, comes from your mother and your mother alone. And that's what they talk about with respect to extranuclear inheritance.
So where it says there that they're thinking that has a lot to do with like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, does that mean that my grandmother had Alzheimer's, so it would be more likely for my mother and then me because
Maybe.
she's my right?
Yeah. There might be a link there. Again, that's new. That's pretty new research, so who knows? So genetic screening, counseling, therapy. Basically what I want you to know from that is some terms like pedigree. In the old days, we used to have to look at actual physical characteristics. And they would make a chart called a pedigree chart. And that would show, for example, eye color from matings in your family. Some of you guys have probably done this yourself. Anybody have a family tree going on? It looks exactly like that. So, you know, Aunt Joan and Uncle Sam, you would look at characteristics that you were interested in tracking. So with my grandfather and his eye color, that might be something I'd be interested in tracking in a pedigree chart. So that's how we used to do it in the old days. Now we have modern technology and genome information. We can actually map your DNA. Fetal testing can also be done. And what we need is cells from the developing fetus or embryo, right? Where am I going to get cells from that developing fetus or embryo? Yeah, I can get it from the amniotic fluid. And I could also get some cells that were representative of the new individual from the chorionic villi. So we can actually test the cells of the developing embryo fetus, usually fetus, because that's when we can get enough amniotic fluid at that point. We can look at those cells and we can map that genetic material. So we can do a karyotype and find out, for example, whether or not that developing individual has some abnormality in their genetic material. Extra chromosomes, for example, extra 21st pair of chromosomes, that can happen too. There's a whole bunch of different genetic abnormalities. Again, I won't get crazy about those. That's a whole nother course for a whole nother day. But sometimes we can possess extra chromosomes, and that will give us an abnormal outcome. Extra 21st chromosome in humans is called Down syndrome. Yeah. It's called a trisomy. So instead of having 2, you have 3. Many of these don't allow the individual to develop and result in miscarriage. But some of them allow the individual to develop and express themselves in that way. Down syndrome is an example of that. Human gene therapy, they give us a little bit of information, really interesting stuff, but the concept of maybe giving you genetic information that you're missing is what human gene therapy is all about. So getting those genes into your cells and allowing your cells to produce things that you might be lacking is what the principle is behind human gene therapy. Some vectors that are used in human gene therapy and human gene research are viral. Because viruses, do you know how viruses work?
They go to your DNA.
Well, they inject their genetic information into your cells and cause your cells to do what? Yeah, make more of them. So if we can use a viral vector, and a vector is just basically something used to insert things that you're lacking. Maybe you have enzyme deficiencies. If we could insert that genetic information into your cells via that viral vector, you might be able to live a normal life. So, yes, dear.
Mutation, you said that you will explain.
Mistakes. Mutations are mistakes.
No, I mean, there was a question on the quiz that I didn't understand. I have no idea what
Mutations are mistakes. For example, in humans, one of the real common ones is a mistake in genetic code of one nitrogenous base that results in one amino acid difference in your hemoglobin molecule. That hemoglobin molecule can then not function as a normal hemoglobin molecule. It's called sickle cell anemia. So a mutation is a mistake. Now, some mistakes in our genome, when it's passed from one cell to another, are never ever noticed. Some mistakes or mutations can result in a different protein. Mutations is why humans have a whole bunch of different eye colors. Mutations is why humans have a whole bunch of different hair colors. Do you see where I'm going with this? So mutations are changes in the original code that results in the production of a different protein. Do you understand now?
Yeah, it wasn't my question. I didn't mean mutation of DNA. There was a question on the quiz about that women would have a
Yeah.
And and there wasn't 4 possibilities of the
Yeah, I didn't
answer.
get that one.
So I have no idea what it's talking
The question
about.
was
If
what
you could
would-
just read
would
it,
her-
because I did not understand.
It was her hand question was if she would repeat, if if the gene would reproduce itself. That was basically the question.
Okay, now,
Because it got hit by an X-ray, so it
right,
mutated.
it mutated. So you as an individual have mutations, yes? They happen all the time in your cells. What's the only way you can pass those mutations down to your offspring? Huh? Or if the mutations get
Copied randomly
in where?
in your DNA,
Where?
in your egg.
Ah! In your gametes. So your cells are mutating all the time. As you get older, your cells mutate. As a matter of fact, not to scare the crap out of you, but your genome as it is no longer just yours. Because as you get older, part of your genome is actually viral. So viruses are constantly, as you age, injecting their genetic material into your genome. But the only way mutations can be passed to your offspring is if that mutation, whatever it may be, is in your what? In your gametes, your reproductive cells. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question, Mila?
Yeah, there was
Does everybody else understand that concept? So remember, you mutate all the time, but you as an individual, you know, you're stuck with those. The only way it's going to be passed is when that mutation happens in gamete production. So you can be perfectly normal too and give abnormal gametes to your offspring if there's a problem during the meiosis process. All right, if you have any